He was born an immigrant kid in the tiny hospital in Alturas, California, where his mother, 2 years before that wealthy young wife of a young buck up-and-coming Basque rancher with 100,000-acre spread, was cooking in the camps after the sheep crash of 1921. He grew up tough and scrappy in Carson City, where she had moved her family for some semblance of stability, buying a house and forcing her kids to learn English. That's when the family grew tight, turned inward, grew clannish. Basques weren't fashionable then. They were accented immigrants with old country ways in a Protestant world. Bruce Laxalt's words. It's important to know that in that process, the first language of Paul Laxalt and Bob Laxalt was Basque. These were little immigrant kids, and they spoke Basque, and they were made fun of by the other kids in town who couldn't figure out what a Basque was, and Mother Teresa decided that they should become Americans and learn English and be good Americans. Bob graduated from the University of Nevada in 1945. He developed a little news service of his own, Capital News Service in Carson City, but then he signed on with the United Press, and for 5 years he developed himself as a journeyman reporter. He then always wanted to write. He founded the University of Nevada Press, and then he wrote a best-selling book called Sweet Promised Land, and that really got him launched. Sweet Promised Land was his first book. In 1954, Bob Laxalt took his father, Dominique Laxalt, to the Basque Country. The sheepherder father had always talked about going home to the Basque Country, but he never really did it. And it turns out he probably didn't really want to. Bob Laxalt and his brothers conspired to have the old sheepherder go home and see the country he had come from. And so Bob accompanied him. And when they got there, the old sheepherder came to realize the real sweet promised land of their life was not the old Basque Country, but was the Carson Valley in the Sierra Nevada, where he had immigrated. And Bob told that story in Sweet Promised Land. I think you got to go to the reviewers, the New York Times and all, that they just simply said that book captured the heart of immigrant families as none other had done yet in the United States. It became an iconic book for the immigration, and it became very famous at its time. It caused a bit of a ripple of effect for Bob Laxalt because he didn't know how to write a book when he started to do it. Bob Laxalt had been a United Press reporter in the Reno Bureau for 5 years. He covered executions and mob hits by double shotgun barrel in alleys in Reno when the mob did that sort of thing. And he became a veteran reporter. But he decided he wanted to write this book about his father. And he didn't know how to do it. So Bob Laxalt sat down and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote, and he couldn't figure it out. He didn't know if it was a biography, a memoir, a novel. He'd never written a book. He knew he wanted to be a writer since he was very young, but he didn't know it. So he would write a page, the opening page, crumple it up, throw it in the wastebasket, take another shot at it, day after day, crumple it up, wasn't good enough. And then he wrote the words. He wrote, "My father was a sheepherder, comma, and his home was the hills, period." And it took off. The book, he unlocked the creative process, and the book just started to tell itself. And then it came out when Harper & Row published it, and it became this beautiful little book. It's not a long book. That just is a very heartfelt book about people all told through this old sheepherder who'd gone home to the Pyrenees only to really learn that he was now an American. Paul was the older brother, and because the father, Dominique, was away in the mountains, almost a hermit-like for many years, the mother, Therese, looked at Paul, the older brother, and said, "Help, you are the oldest, so help with the family." And so Paul became like a surrogate father-brother to his three brothers and two sisters. Paul was recruited into politics. Paul Laxalt ran for lieutenant governor and won, and then subsequently ran for governor and won. Paul Laxalt, after being governor, stepped out of politics. He thought he had enough. So he went, they built a hotel in Carson City, family pulled together, and then Paul Laxalt changed his mind, decided that public life was what he should be doing, and he decided to run for the United States Senate. And when he ran against Harry Reid, the polls were down to the wire that Harry was going to win, and Paul just was not going to be able to pull it off. Harry was a very prominent politician at that time, and Paul had stepped out of the public life. The Paul Laxalt group of advisors came to the conclusion that there was one way to beat Harry Reid, Sweet Promised Land. And they looked at it and said, we need to bring out that book. We'll flood the northern Nevada with copies of it, and that will reintroduce Paul Laxalt to the voters of Nevada as the son of a Basque sheep herder. Paul Laxalt beat Harry Reid very closely, and they all gave credit to this book. That caused a bit of a problem. Bill Douglas, who was a very close friend of Bob Laxalt's, is a Basque scholar himself, and told Bob, you really don't have a right to turn that book. That book belongs to the Basque people, but it does not belong as part of political fodder to help your brother get elected. And Bob was very concerned about that. But the pull of his brother's, the love for his brother, and that Basque blood that they shared overruled his own creative notions to keep that strictly as a piece of literature, which it was. And so he did the afterward, they did publish the book, and Paul Laxalt won the race. Bob was well known through his literary writing. He's well established. He wrote many books, and it was just, he became an author, and that's what he was known for. But his early journalism was not widely known. There was no reason for it. He became much more famous as an author. And I knew him from where he started as a reporter. And my concentration on that Robert Laxalt book was to tell how he became what he became, which is in the Hemingway, Steinbeck, Jack London, Mark Twain tradition of reporters becoming authors. So I concentrated in that book of telling about Robert Laxalt and his journalistic career. Hemingway said that the best literary advice he ever got was the Kansas City Star style book. Write short, punchy sentences. Use active verbs. Journalists who turn to authorship have that built into them. It's part of their DNA. They don't just suddenly flower and become something different. They become an extension of what they are. And they are storytellers who we like to say journalism is literature in a hurry. Or we like to say that it's history as it happens, because we tell it on breaking deadlines. And writers who break in under those tensions of journalism take that discipline with them into authorship. When he died in 2001, 6 months before he died, he received word from the University of Nevada Press that his manuscript about his writing life would be published. It was called Travels with My Royal, the Life of a Writer, a Writer's Life. Once having decided back then to become a writer, I hadn't the remotest idea what was involved in a writing life. As a boy, just growing up into adulthood, I knew no writers, nor had I ever read anything about the lives they led. I knew nothing about a writer writes, how a writer lives, how much a writer money he makes, where a writer goes to find time to write, about what makes a story, and most important of all, where and to whom a writer goes for enlightenment on these myriad questions. I was to learn the answers through the years of growing up and the years that followed. They came in a slow and often painful process that never ended. I suspect they will continue to come all of a writer's life until the day he puts his pen down for the last time.